Let me bring in Nationals MP and former Resources Minister Keith Pitt joining us from Bundaberg. Good to talk to you again, Keith. Look, it's quite astonishing. This is not a surprise to you, of course. You know about the logic behind this. But Tony Blair there back in 2006 was so clear that if you want security, reliability and emissions-free power, you've got to have a big role for nuclear.
Well, that's spot on. I mean, if you want emissions-free, reliable energy, that is your option. I mean, we're seeing proposals at the moment for Tasmanias of solar arrays. I mean, no one's going to be able to clear that much land in Australia. You can't even clear it now to plant crops. So it's just nonsensical what's being proposed by Chris Bowen and the Labor Party. It just won't happen.
Well, this is the problem. Now, we're looking at people waking up to reality around the world. We focused on the UK there. We know Germany's trying to extend the life of some nuclear power stations. We know Japan is doing the same. We know other countries are looking at constructing more nuclear power stations, particularly in China and North Asia. How quickly could Australia act, must Australia act, so that we can avoid the horrible energy crisis that Europe's going through at the moment?
Oh, I think it's a 15-year proposition at a minimum. Even with AUKUS, even with all the things that are happening around the defence space, you need to build the technical capability. You need to go through a communications process. You need communities to volunteer for a site. You need to work through all the geophys and the geotech and find things which are technically feasible. And that takes a long time. You've only got to look at the low-level radioactive waste facility in South Australia, 40 years plus.
Yeah, well, this is the point, though, isn't it? This is the point of me going back to Tony Blair in 2006, because they didn't act then, and it would have saved the day now. And when we talk about this, because it's a long-term project, we think, oh, we'll just take our time getting on with it. Well, we've been talking about this for decades. The first serious consideration of nuclear energy in Australia was in the 1970s. We've got to actually start the process, because we are going to end up there, and the sooner we do it, the better.
Well, you're exactly right, but it does take a brave political party to put it forward, because it's a really easy scare campaign to run. But we want a conversation with the Australian people. They've got to be involved. They're the ones that will make the decision. And we just want them to be well informed and able to have the debate without Labor running off and throwing scare campaigns in their letterbox.
Now, there's been a lot of talk, including with you and others, and I've focused on this with some experts, on these small modular reactors, the new technology, basically prefabricated, drop-in small nuclear reactors that definitely would have a role in a place like Australia. But are we ducking the bigger argument that before we even do that, we could go with existing technology and have a couple of decent-sized fixed nuclear reactors generating energy, electricity into the transmission lines that already exist in places like the Latrobe Valley, the Hunter Valley and the Iron Triangle in South Australia, where huge coal-fired generation plants have been mothballed?
Oh, look, I'm a realist, Chris. I just don't think that's going to happen. I think we need to focus on the new technology. We've got a very small reactor in Sydney used for producing nuclear isotopes for nuclear medicine, and that's difficult enough. You've got to build all of the regulatory background, you need technical skills, and you need to have a willing community. I think that'd be unlikely. I think small modular reactors
why is that?
In Australia.
Isn't that how we end up in this situation today? Isn't this how the UK ends up in its energy crisis today? Because people say early on, oh, it's all too hard. If it's logical, if it makes sense, if it stacks up, don't we just need to have some politicians who will advocate it, take the hard arguments and get it done?
I'm very happy to take on the arguments and have a discussion with the Australian people, but unfortunately the Labor Party is not, Chris. They've said outright that they're not interested in this, they won't support nuclear, and yet they're going to run off on this green fantasy, which will put our country at risk, in my view. It will affect our national security, because your energy security is critical to the performance of your country, and they want to build things which are intermittent, which decide to turn themselves on and off dependent on the weather. That's in no one's interest. It
is amusing, isn't it? They talk about nuclear as being too hard, yet that latest study this week by the 3 universities talks about 4 solar farms the size of Tasmania and a spend on energy of something like $180 billion a year, and transmission overseas and back and forth across the country. It just never will happen, yet they pretend that approach is plausible. Let's just move on to another issue, Keith. And this afternoon, the Prime Minister himself announced this inquiry by the former former High Court judge into Scott Morrison and his ministries. Your reaction to that inquiry? Do we need to drill down into any more detail, or do we already know what needs to be known?
I'm sure Anthony Albanese's seen a political motive and an outcome, but for me, in terms of my participation, Chris, I'll have to take advice on that. There is an actual court case underway, which in my view will have a precedent over whatever kangaroo court that Mr Albanese may or may not want to run. So I'll be leaning towards the actual courts and what their requirements are. But I'll be out taking advice before I make a decision on whether I even participate.
But what would be the harm in you talking in private to the former High Court Justice Virginia Bell and telling her what you knew and what went on? None of that would affect the court case because none of it presumably would be made public.
Oh, well, that's not what Mr Albanese said. He said they would make some things public and others, and they'd have to make a decision.
Sure. Let me correct myself then. I mean, of course we want transparency, but it wouldn't be made public until it could be kept quiet until after that court case is dealt with.
Well, they've said they'll table the report, is my understanding. It'll be done in November. And the priority is the Australian court system. I am very cautious about what's happening there, as I'm sure you can understand. And it is around that decision. So I think that caution is warranted, and it's one I'll continue to keep.
Yes, indeed. What a tangled web this is all left for everyone to unravel. Thanks for joining us, Keith. I appreciate your time.
It's great to be with you.